There we go. It's really great to be here today, and I just want to thank you for allowing me to be present. And I'd like to point something out. I have more than one tie. When we see the slide deck, you're going to notice that I'm wearing the same slide on the first slide deck, and I just wanted to get that out of the way. It's really awesome to be here. There it is. I get a chance to speak all over Canada, the United States, and today it's a really good fit to speak to municipal leaders because my story relates a lot. I come from a small town, and I'm here today because of a community investment gone well. I'm here today because of over 10,000 people and because I had access to resources. And some of the things that we're advocating for and share a similar voice when we're asking government at municipal, provincial, and federal levels what we need to do to actually create systemic change. But sometimes I speak at places where I don't know why the fit is so good. And one of those happened a few years ago. I had to speak to the Alberta Engineering Association. And the Alberta Engineering Association is a group of men and women, people throughout Alberta who build bridges and tunnels for a living. And so I was driving there in my rental car from Calgary. I live in White Rock, and I flew to Calgary. And I'm driving to Red Deer in my little rental car, and I'm thinking, what does a guy who lived under bridges and tunnels for 10 years of his life say to people who build bridges and tunnels? And the best thing I could come up with was, thanks. Keep up the good work. If the economy keeps up, we're counting on you. I do have a bit of a dark sense of humor. Sometimes it gets me in trouble. I had to speak a few years ago at the Ontario Provincial Police Commissioners event, and I was sitting at the head table, and beside me was the commissioner of the OPP, and the other side was the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And the waiter asked if I wanted a drink, and instead of just saying no, I said I can't. The waiter says, "Why can't you have a drink?" And I didn't want to tell this guy my life story. I've been sober for 2 decades. So I just said to him, I'm allergic to alcohol. And he says, "You're allergic to alcohol? What kind of reaction do you have when you drink?" And I said, I break out in handcuffs. And I look over this way, and the commissioner, he's spitting his drink out. He thought that was quite funny. He got the joke. But I looked over this way, and I'm not sure the Lieutenant Governor got the joke, or maybe didn't think it was funny, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Look, I open with humor for one very specific reason. I think it's one of the greatest assets that we can take to adversity and challenge today. You know, let's face it, the last 15 months has been extraordinarily difficult. And having a sense of humor gives us the ability to shift the context of how we see the world. And it allows us to make new meaning. And I think more than anything today, we need to find every tool in the toolkit to shift the way we're seeing the world, to imagine that different kind of politics that the MLA was speaking of earlier. And I think that having a sense of humor is, one of the greatest weapons that we can take to adversity. When I ran my small company many years ago, and I heard laughter, to me, laughter is audible hope. And I think more than ever today, we need hope, and we need to laugh, and we need to smile, and we need to get back to, those days where things are a little lighter. And so I would encourage you as leaders to try and find those ways. I want to take you back to the streets of Vancouver in 1989 and tell you a story. Next slide. So this here is a picture of me in 1989. I was one of those people you'd see pushing a shopping cart, collecting cans and bottles. I struggled with mental health. I struggled with addiction. I struggled with housing. And I really struggled to find my possibility and potential. And the reason why I say this is a good fit today is that I'm here today because I did and was able to access resources. I'm here today because of over 10,000 people who were there to champion me, who were there to protect me when I was vulnerable. And then access to shelters and treatment centers and schools and all of the things that are the heart blood of your community. And if I didn't have access to those, I honestly don't know where I would be today. Now, before I go much further into this story, my goal today is to get you to see things a little bit differently and to get you to imagine and see things through a possibility mindset. And so in order to do that, I'm going to share my story. So I want to talk a little bit about possibility. Next slide. So possibility mindset is this context in which I see my life as a leader, as a speaker, as a father, as a husband. Now, what do I mean by possibility? Possibility is looking at the world and not seeing it the way it is, but reimagining. Possibility is at the heart of vision. Possibility is what put us on the moon. Possibility is behind every social justice movement. Possibility is what inspired a young man with only one leg to run across Canada to try and eradicate cancer. Possibility is what Einstein pointed to when he talked about imagination. Now, the opposite of possibility is probability. Probability is when we get stuck in these repeating patterns of predicting what's going to be. Now, if you would have seen me on the street 30 years ago, you would have predicted that I was going to be there the next day. And that's why I asked the question, and I spelt it wrong, my apologies, but what if today was a new beginning? What if today we shifted the way we see things? You see, because everything that we see and experience in our material world first started in someone's mind, a possibility. And then what great leaders and parents do is then they take that possibility as their mantle and they lead folks towards it. The challenge is when we're facing crisis and we're facing challenges, the never-ending deluge of change that we've experienced the last 15 months, it's easy to get knocked out of possibility and get into probability mindset. And probability is looking at the way the world is and predicting what it'll be like tomorrow. It's also not as positive a place to be. It's a place where complaints reside and not much solution. In fact, when we're in our probability mindset, it's difficult for us to access those right part of our brains that allow us to imagine and to connect to purpose and passion. Now, my story doesn't begin in the downtown east side. I started my life in a tiny little town north of Toronto. Next slide. This is me in grade 2. And I was a rambunctious little guy. And I grew up in Midland, Ontario. And back in those days, Midland was a town of about 5,000. And I know there's folks on the call saying 5,000, that's a huge town. It was a small community. And I remember growing up the benefits of a small community, And I remember being in school, and I liked school. School was awesome. But what I liked more than school was my home life. Waiting for me at home, next slide, was this extraordinary family. I had a dad who was awesome. He worked at the local seatbelt factory, and he was this, larger than life guy who used to speak to my potential, my possibility. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. It's not that she couldn't have gone to university and got an education and entered the career, entered a career. She just wanted to be mom. And that was, it was the 1970s, and that was the role that she chose to play. I had an older brother and a younger sister and a plump little dog named Angus that had magical powers. He could hear you unwrap a cheese wrapper from 3 blocks away. We called him Mooch the Pooch. For the first 8 years of my life, everything was perfect. My dad, next slide, he was the kind of guy who was deeply invested in our family. And I remember in my father's shadow, I felt I could do or be anything. My father used to say things to me like, I love you, you can do and be anything. And I felt in his shadow, I felt safe, I felt protected, and I felt my potential. Unfortunately, in 1975, life lifed us. And we got a knock on the door, and just like that, Dad was gone. He died suddenly from a massive heart attack. Next slide. And so literally overnight, we went from being, lower middle class to being well below the poverty line. This last year has been challenging for so many people. And I remember at a very young age feeling that uncertainty, that anxiousness, that anxiety. And my mom now had to raise 3 kids, ages 5, 8, and 11. And she didn't even have a job at the time. And so, there was a lot of relying on community resources and community and people. And it was in those moments I was grateful. We had that small town. I mean, there's merits to both small and big communities, but on that day, it was, in that time, it was important for us to lean on our neighbors. Mom did the best she could with what she had. And what she, I guess, thought her best thinking was to remarry. Dad was the breadwinner of the family, and so we lost his income. And so Mom remarried really quick. And the guy who came into the home next wasn't anything like my dad. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. And so next slide. I went from this, kid who was having some struggles, trying to figure out how he fit in the world, that, had one strike already with the trauma of losing my father. But now I had this violent, abusive alcoholic who would say things to me like, "You're stupid, you're dumb, and you'll never amount to anything." And I was 8 years old, and I really didn't know how to process that properly. And so at a very young age, I had the beginnings of some mental health challenges. When the opportunity presented itself, my brother and his older friends were using and experimenting with drugs, and they invited me. And I joined. And I joined and did drugs with them that day not because I was curious about getting high, or I thought it would be cool, or I was being rebellious. I joined because I wanted to fit in. The one thing that I've shared with over 1 million young people over the last 20 years is to not sacrifice your value system just to fit in. What ended up happening to me is, under the influence, I went home, and my stepfather came home from a day of drinking, as he did pretty much every day, and he would come into the house very loud and intimidating. And one of his sort of modes of operation was he would then proceed to intimidate and yell us down and threaten violence. And I remember he came up to me, and he was being intimidating. And for the first time in my life, under the influence of alcohol and drugs, I wasn't afraid of him. Gabor Mate talks about trauma as being one of the leading causes of addiction. And, drugs gave me in that moment protection in an uncertain world. And I find it fascinating over the last year how we as people have adapted and responded to the stressors in our life. Not always the best responses, but it's pretty normal and natural given a set of stressors and a challenging time that's wrought with fear and uncertainty. We tend to eat more and drink more. We tend to find whatever we can, any port in a storm, to alter our sense of insecurity. At 9 years old, I had found something that would protect me from the unsafe world, and I latched onto it. And over the next several years, that was my go-to. I had not dealt with the early childhood trauma, losing dad, and the trauma of the physical and mental abuse in the household. When we talk about bullying, I had a bully that lived at home. And so by the time I was 15, next slide, I was angry. I was coming out sideways. I was really mad at the world. I got into a fight with my stepfather, and I won. So I was asked to leave the house. At 15 years old, I didn't have the skill set to take care of myself in the world. And I was one of those young people in the community that was invisibly homeless. I was couch surfing. And in that couch surfing where, I wasn't holding a sign in front of a liquor store begging for change. I wasn't visibly homeless, but I was at that, I had that housing scarcity. I had that housing insecurity. Sorry, not housing scarcity, housing insecurity. And so I was going from couch to flop house to drug house and in those environments, I was exposed to all kinds of everything else. By the time I was 16, I dropped out of school. And by the time I was 17, I'd gone to prison for the first time. What I understand today as a youth advocate is that if you can get a kid to believe a lie about who they are, you can predict some of their poor choices. And I think one of the greatest things that we can do in community is to really advocate for those early detection and prevention. Not to say that emergency services aren't key. They're absolutely key, right? But if we want to take a long-term view of some of these things, we need to look at early detection and prevention. Anyways, around this time, I had one person in my life who really believed in me, and that was a girl I was dating in grade 10. And I remember what I loved about our relationship is she saw me for who I really was. But my behavior and my drug use was beginning to escalate. And one day she sat down, next slide, and she said to me, you know, I really appreciate who you are and I admire you a great deal. And you know, I love you, but I'm going in a different way. And just like that, that relationship dissolved. And so again, I was impacted by this sense of abandonment. At this point, you know, I went from that little town and decided to come to Vancouver. I went down to the Greyhound station in Toronto, and I got on a Greyhound bus, and 3.5 days later, I landed in Vancouver. And back in those days, the bus station in Vancouver was on Georgia Street. And I remember I went down to this little park that was on the corner of Georgia and Cambie. And the sun was coming up over the downtown east side of Vancouver. And I remember having this hope, this inspiring, overwhelming feeling like, yes, this is the town I'm going to make it in. Little did I know that within 3 weeks, that park was going to become my home. You see, what I didn't factor in is, as a youth at risk, I didn't have the coping skills, and I was basically jumping out of the pot of that small community, that community where I had relatives, school, family, oversight, resources, to moving to a city where I didn't. I think one of the things that we need to work on is to try and keep people and communities intact. Right? Because when a young person leaves a small community and goes to a Victoria or a Vancouver or a Kelowna, that stuff gets severed. You know, I went from the park to under the Georgia Street Viaduct, and over the next several years, my life spiraled completely out of control. Next slide. By this time in my life, it was the late 1980s, and I was struggling with habitual opiate addiction. I had graduated from alcohol and marijuana to cocaine and heroin. And by this point in my life, I was addicted to opiates. I was addicted to heroin. And to try and give you an understanding of at least my perspective, I'm not an expert on the opioid crisis, but I can tell you that it's incredibly difficult as an individual to break the cycle of addiction without resources and support. And I remember one day I was going through withdrawal. It was about 3 days before Christmas, and I was rocking back and forth in downtown Vancouver in Pigeon Park, and withdrawal from opiates is like the worst flu you've ever had times 100. You get cold sweats, you get a high level of anxiety, you get a real, like, you can't sleep, you can't eat, it's just this really, really dark, high anxiety. You get this really dark darkness that sort of comes over you. And so imagine like the worst flu you've ever had times 100. And you know that the $10 will make it go away. And that's kind of what opioid addiction is like. And so I needed that $10 that day. And I didn't want to rob and I didn't want to steal, because that's just not who I was. But in the pouring rain, sitting on that park bench, I looked down at my feet and came up with what I thought was a good solution. I walked into the bar across the street. I walked out 10 minutes later, having sold the only item I had left in the world that was worth anything. And that was the boots I was wearing that day. And I remember walking down East Hastings Street completely broken as a human being. You know, to say I had suicidal ideation is an understatement. I just didn't want to be on this planet anymore. I was so sick of life. Life hurt so much. You know, when the pandemic hit 15 months ago and I watched my friends who had businesses and restaurants, and, you know, I just watched it all just started to happen. And I totally empathized with what they were going through, that fear, that uncertainty, just not knowing what to do. You know, people have asked me, they say, Joe, what's it like to be homeless? Well, now you know if you've been through the pandemic. There's social isolation. There's hard to access resources. There's, you know, there's an emotional disconnection from the world around you. You go to bed with fears, worries, and anxieties, and you wake up with problems that don't have solution. And in the midst of all that chaos, you continue to get hammered with the insecurity and the uncertainty. And in that, you don't necessarily make the right choices and responses to the stressors in your world. That's what homelessness is like. That's what a pandemic's like. In that moment of desperation, I did something different. Instead of acting on that suicidal ideation, I reached out and I asked for help. And I came in the form of a little prayer. And I said, God, give me a second chance. I don't deserve it. But if you give me a second chance, I'll make the most of it and I'll do something to help others. I would never describe myself as someone who's deeply religious, but I've always believed in something. Well, the next day, I walked into a frontline resource center that was in my community, and they helped connect me with my mom. And I called my mom, and I had a relationship with my mom still, but it was strained because every time I called her, it was to ask her for bailout or help. And I asked her one last time. I said, "Mom, will you help me one last time? I need help. I need to get into treatment or something." And she said, "I'll help you, son." One last time. And she flew out to Vancouver. She met me right in the corner, Main and Hastings. She gave me a kiss in the cheek. And she said, "Let's get you the help you need." And she brought me back to Ontario, where I entered into a detox facility and a full residential treatment program. When I was on the street, next slide, I met a man who would end up giving me my life's mantra. And his name was Gus. And the reason, it's really funny, as a leader, I think about my life, and I'm the sum of about 5 people who have helped me along the way. And Gus was one of them. And he spent a whopping 10 minutes with me. I met Gus in Pigeon Park in downtown Vancouver. And I remember I met Gus, and at the time I was homeless. And I remember he looked at me and he says, "Joe," he says, "you're an extraordinary young man." He says, "If you were able to ever deal with your addiction and your homelessness, you could go on to do big things with your life." He said to me, he looked at me and he said, "There's more to you than you can see." At the time, what was sitting beside Gus was a man who was dirty and disheveled, a scruffy beard, matted hair, black fingernails, clothes I've been wearing for months, and a stink that comes from poor personal hygiene of sleeping outside. But he looked past everything on the surface. He looked past my probability and spoke to my possibility. And I think that's what we need to do as great leaders, is to see potential and possibility. Work to draw that out in people, work to draw that out in our communities, and work, like the MLA said, in creating collaboration so that we can come together on the important issues that impact us all. Gus was right. I got a second chance, and my life started to take off. Back in Ontario, after 6 months in treatment, I got an opportunity to go back to college. And so I did. I entered into the community college. Next slide. And I remember when I walked onto the campus at Loyalist College, I had a lot of fear and trepidation. I certainly was in a probability mindset. I always thought I was dumb growing up. But given the opportunity, and I had these great college professors, and they really helped to work with me, I continued to take steps forward in the face of fear and uncertainty. And even though I didn't feel like doing these things, and I didn't know that I would have a positive outcome, I took those steps anyways. Well, the weeks turned to months and the months to years. And finally, after 3.5 years at Loyalist College, on a beautiful sunny day, just like it is today here in White Rock, they called out my name. They said, "Joe Roberts, Dean's List." Next slide. And I remember walking across that stage with this big grin on my face. I still didn't get a haircut, though. I'm a bit of a hipster back then. What was remarkable about that day is I went down to where my mom was sitting, a woman who never, ever stopped believing in me. And she kissed me on the cheek. She said, "I love you, son." And you know what I thought about that day? I thought about how many people just like me who have all the potential in the world, but they don't have my mom and they don't have someone like Gus saying, "I believe in you." And I think that even as challenging as things are, that's what we need to continue to do. is to champion and to provide as many resources as possible to try and turn some of these things around. After graduating college, I went out into the workforce and I got my first job at Minolta, Canada. Next slide. And I remember working at Minolta. I have to tell you something funny though. I went to the job interview and I wasn't really dressed properly. And I was staying at my brother's house. I moved back to Vancouver after 5 years in Ontario, going to school and building a foundation in my sobriety. I decided to come back to Vancouver and give it another shot. And I was scared, but anyways, my sister-in-law got me an interview at Minolta, and I went to this job interview, and this is what I was wearing. I'll tell you something. Homelessness will do funny things to your sense of fashion. I was wearing brown corduroy pants, the real thick cords, and a herringbone jacket that had the elbow patches, but this patch was missing. And then I had on what I thought was a dress shirt, but it was like a Saskatchewan dress shirt. It was flannel, right? But it had buttons to the top, so I thought, that's a dress shirt. And then I had to have a tie, but I didn't know how to tie a tie, so it had to be one of those clip-ons. I was wearing this black Wham leather tie, like a club tie. Yeah, I go to this job interview looking, I don't know what I looked like, but I didn't look like a professional salesperson. But here's what was funny is that my sales manager, Lanny, he hired me on the spot. And 10 years later, he was asked by the CBC, why? Why did you hire Joe? And this is what he said. He said, Joe was hungry. Joe was passionate. And you can't teach hungry. In the midst of all the challenges that we have today, I want to encourage you to connect to what's most important. What's important to you and the legacy and the fingerprints that you want to leave on your community. Because when you find that, you find an unfathomable amount of energy to get the work done. You can move mountains. You combine purpose and passion with possibility, and that's stuff that changes the world. I did well at Minolta, and after a few years at Minolta, I got an offer from a friend of mine who was starting a tech company. That was the late 1980s. The tech sector was exploding. So I joined him, and we worked really hard the next 4.5 years doing the same thing I did in the very beginning. Just getting up every day, putting my shoes on, and taking some steps forward. One day I was in my car and I was driving down into downtown Vancouver, and I was in one of those hazes where you're not really paying attention, and when you're in those hazes and you kind of go from one driveway to another without even thinking. Well, I snapped out of that haze when I found myself at the corner of Dunleavy and Hastings, and I looked out my window in this big, expensive automobile that I was driving, and there was a kid about 19 pushing a shopping cart, dirty hair, scruffy beard. And it hit me how far I'd come. In less than 12 years, I went from a heroin addict living under the Georgia Street Viaduct, next slide, to being on the cover of Canadian Business as a celebrated entrepreneur. I was the Canadian version of the American dream. If that story ended right now, that'd be good. But I have to tell you, it didn't. In 2003, I became disenchanted with the business world. And I wanted to do something that had more meaning and purpose to me. The thing that I love doing more than anything is getting people to see the world through a different lens. Right? And it's the greatest work that I can do is by sharing my lived experience and my passion for change, to try and shift policy, to change minds, to collapse stigma, to point to some of the key things that we need to create systemic change, whether it's the opioid crisis or child safety, to continue to advocate for both big and large communities to come together to get the resources they need to serve and support the poor and marginalized peoples within those communities, not just for those communities, but for the businesses in those communities, for that community to work properly, right? Because we can't ignore these problems, because then it impacts all kinds of other things. It's that domino chain effect. And I agree that we politicize some of these things. For years, I've watched homelessness as a political football, not just in Canada, in the United States. In the past year and a half, it's been the police as a political football. Right? And the MLA is bang on. If we don't collapse some of this stuff and come together to work on the important issues, when one loses, we all lose. And so around this time, I decided I wanted to commit my life to do something different, to be a voice, and to really shine a light on some of the things that are important to me. And so On an airplane ride going to Calgary with my then business partner, Dr. Sean Richardson, premier sports psychologist, former Olympic athlete, I said to Sean, I made a promise back on a street corner 30 years ago, or 25, back then it was 25 years ago. And next slide. And I told Sean about that promise I made, that if I got a second chance at life, I would pay it forward. And so we started talking about what I could do. And I'm really passionate, as you can probably pick up today, about some core issues. And I said, Sean, I want to do something to raise awareness for youth at risk. Youth at risk in all communities, kids that come from impossible backgrounds, that are struggling with mental health and addiction, early childhood trauma, family conflict. What can we do to better protect them so they don't push a shopping cart? And Sean said, why don't you run across Canada? I said, why don't you run across Canada? At the time I was 45, I was a non-athlete. I said, I'm not running across anything. He says, okay, don't run. How about you walk? He says, when Canadians want to raise money, they go across the country. It's kind of our thing, Joe. And I got thinking, I remember meeting Terry Fox when I was 13, and Rick Hansen endorsed one of my first books. And I thought, that'll work. That's a great engagement idea that would bring all kinds of big and small communities together. So then I said, well, how is it going to be different? There's so many walks. He says, why don't you push a shopping cart? It's a symbol of chronic homelessness, the thing that you're trying to avoid for every kid. You can call it a push for change. I remember the hair on my neck went up. Well, the first problem we had was a shopping cart. Next slide. So we went out and we got kids from a local high school, and they came up with this really cool, groovy shopping cart. Now we had was 9,000 other things that we had to do before we could be ready to walk across Canada. And over the next couple of years, that's exactly what we did. We worked tirelessly in our possibility to build out this engagement campaign, not to walk across Canada, but to have a conversation with leaders and stakeholders at all levels in big and small communities on what we can do to better protect young people. Finally, the day arrived, next slide, where I was in St. John's, Newfoundland. And I have to tell you, this picture is really great. And I'm smiling, but inside I'm freaking out. Because in front of me, this was May 1st, 2016, in front of me, is 9,000 kilometers of highway that I was going to have to walk over the next 17 months through one Canadian winter. And I had two fears. One, nobody was going to care. And two, my body was going to break down and I wasn't going to make it. Well, I was wrong on both fronts. Not only that, I was really wrong on how well Canadians would be inspired and respond to the walk across Canada. This video, it's real inspiring, and I'm sure you'll like it. It captures what happened when we walked across Canada. Cue video.
This is for every kid in this country who feels different, who gets stuck. And it's our responsibility to reach out and help those children transition safely into adulthood.
Sometimes it's a
coming over the bridge, here we are, and there's Joe. Push for change.
Have courage to fight, the people around you care. There's no wrong or right, just a love that we can share. Ain't no pain, how we've suffered along the way. Underneath our clothes, our souls remain unchanged. They're awesome. Take off your mask of fear and push for change. Throw off your coat of doubt and embrace the rain. Everyone is unique, yet we're a part of the human race.
I don't know if you noticed that little loop at the end in the video, but when we were putting the campaign together, there was absolutely no way that we were just going to finish in Vancouver without going to the island. And so when we came into Vancouver the first time, we went over the North Shore, caught the ferry, went to Nanaimo. And although we would have liked to have mapped the entire island, we did get a chance to go to many of the smaller communities in the southern part of the island, from Nanaimo down through Duncan, and then eventually into Victoria, where then we circled back and actually completed the walk in Vancouver. What was amazing about the Push for Change was not that I walked 9,000 kilometers or 11,375,000 steps. It was the people that came out and supported us. It was the people who also shared that values, the values that we stood for, which is to better protect and support young people. And, you know, the other thing that I found fascinating is that we had great events in the larger communities, but it was the smaller communities that actually received us really, really well. It was also interesting to have conversations with municipal leaders and frontline stakeholders. And one of the things that we quickly understood is that word collaboration that the MLA used a few times is a lot stronger in smaller communities. And when you talk to the experts like the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and Dr. Stephen Gates and from Homeless Hub, or Melanie Redmond from Away Home Canada, these are people who deeply understand these issues. And they've pointed and trained and taught us that the solutions really lie in that collaboration, and smaller communities are better at collaborating. And I look at what's happened the last 15 months, and I'm optimistic in that the adversity and the challenges that we've been thrust into have built assets that we've yet to use. You know, my time in the street, I wouldn't wish to anybody, but it's the greatest asset I have. In fact, I've used it to impact over 1 million young people over the last 20 years. It was the thrust behind the Walk Across Canada. And so while we're going through all of this stuff that we're going through, and there is an enormous amount of change, and I'm not discounting the work that needs to get done, but I am saying that we're growing and becoming stronger for the process. Things in Atlantic Canada were awesome, but when we got into Ontario, it really started to take hold because we had a community safety partnership with the Ontario Provincial Police. Next slide. And so, you know, I'd walked for about 5 months, and finally I got to the bridge that brought us into Hawkesbury, Ontario, which is just east of Ottawa. And I remember walking over that bridge, and I came down on the other side, and I was so inspired because waiting for me was about 1,000 people. Biggest crowd I'd seen in 5 months, biggest crowd I'd ever seen anywhere during the Push for Change. And as I got to the bottom of the bridge, there was someone real special waiting for me. Next slide. It was the greatest hockey dad in the world, Walter Gretzky. Walter walked with us that day, and the Wayne Gretzky Foundation made a generous donation to our cause. And here I'm getting to spend time with someone who I believe to be an iconic Canadian, someone who really embodies grit and resilience. And I wanted to learn. And so I said, Walter, what one piece of advice would you give, you know, someone who's struggling to get through their day, whether it's a young person or, you know, me on my walk? What would you say to them? And he looked at me and he says, sometimes you're going to want to quit, but don't ever quit. And I remember at the time thinking that was a little simplistic. But now, you know, when I reflect on it, and when I reflected on it in Northern Ontario, when I hit those snowstorms, next slide, it dawned on me that those simple words of encouragement, don't quit, are sometimes what we need to hear the most. When I got into Northern Ontario, it just got hairy and weird. And I remember, you know, this is in Sault Ste. Marie. And people have asked me, where were you in the winter during the Walk Across Canada? In the wintertime, I was in Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, Wawa, Thunder Bay, Nipigon, Dryden, Espanola, and then Kenora, and then we hit the Manitoba border in April. So I basically did Northern Ontario over Lake Superior in the dead of winter, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth in the winter. Minus 40 with 70-kilometer-an-hour winds coming off of Superior. And so things got weird, and then they got weirder. Next slide. And I remember posting this picture, and my mom called me. She's tracking us on Facebook, and she says, "What are you doing, you kids, and your dangerous selfies?" And I said, Mom, it's Photoshop." And she says, "I don't care what kind of bear it is." We had to explain to Mom that it was a doctored image. Anyways, gotta love Mom, always trying to protect her kids, right? Anyways, things went really well. One day, next slide, I was having a really tough day. A day probably like many days you've had in the office or in your communities over the last 15 months. A day where it just seems hard, and no matter what you do, you're not getting ahead. And yeah, it was exhausting. I was in Wawa area and the hills and the snow and the cold. It was starting to wear me down, and I wanted to give up, but I kept going like Walter told me to. And I finally, at the end of that day, rounded the corner, and I found myself in the shadow of the Wawa Goose. Next slide. And I don't know what it is about the Wawa Goose that it's so iconically Canadian. If you've ever driven across Canada, this has been probably a bio break for you on the side of the highway. It's the best. It's Canada's version of the Statue of Liberty, I think. No, maybe not. But it is this iconic Canadian symbol that seems to get into every montage video that represents our country. And I remember having this overwhelming feeling of pride and gratitude on that day, because I remember standing in the shadow of that silly goose, and I began to be overwhelmed with joy and gratefulness as I realized I had just walked halfway across Canada, and whatever I was afraid of back in Newfoundland was behind me. Yeah, I live in a country that's more than lighthouses and lobsters and rivers and lakes and trees. It's more than the wheat-swept plains of the prairies, of the snow-capped mountains, of the Rockies, of the Eagles, of the Pacific Coast. We are a collection of values, an idea, and an experiment, and we are bound together by possibility mindset with thinkers and actors like Walter Gretzky, who show us the way, who point and shine light on possibility, that anything, if we put our minds and our effort and our energy and our passion towards, we can do. Because in that moment, I realized whatever I was afraid of in Newfoundland was behind me. The worst was behind me. And that's how I feel today. And we're not through it, but the worst is behind us. And I knew that in that moment, just like I feel today, that I was, and we are going to make it. And I was right. Because 7 months later, next slide, I walked into downtown East Vancouver. My last kilometer was walking past the PNE, through Nanaimo, right down into the downtown east side, to the Cenotaph, and then up to the Vancouver Public Library. And I remember, for years, I used to push that shopping cart in my community, and I used to feel ashamed. I didn't feel that shame that day. I felt proud. And I remember walking past that bench, that same bench I sold my boots on, that bench that Gus told me there was more to me than I could see. That bench I made that promise on. And I had a little smile on my face. I would be regretful if I didn't tell you who worked harder on this campaign than me, and that was the campaign director, Marie. Next slide. Throughout this campaign, I was well supported by a team of people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, and they all went through Marie. Marie fielded thousands and thousands and thousands of emails. She was the heart behind the cart. She organized every event, every police liaison, every community support, every mayor handshake, every presentation inside chambers, all of the different events that we went to, and all the different logistics and all the fundraising and all of the work. My job was to walk and talk, and she managed everything else. I'm fond of Marie because she did an extraordinary job, selfless sacrifice to the cause. I'm also fond of Marie, next slide, because we share our life together as husband and wife. And it is our collective vision that drives forward the action steps that we take today to try and make a safer world for our community, for our kids, for the kids around us, and in the work that we do in the push for change. But there's something else that connects Marie and I, and that's our past. You see, Marie is the same girl from grade 10. And after 28 years, we refound each other, and we were in very similar life circumstances. We fell in love again and got married 2 months before we shoved off for the push for change. I believe in possibility. Next slide. I believe that anything is possible if we connect three simple things. You see, working in the walk across Canada, both Sean and I discovered there's a very simple model for behavioral change or creating possibility in our lives, and that is to manage our actions, our inspiration, and our roadblock. I got asked by reporters so many times, how did you do it? How did you do it? And they're looking for this, you know, some sort of life hack or some sort of personal development secret, but there is no secret to creating change in the world. There's creating a possibility and then managing three simple things. Next slide. And those things look like action, inspiration, roadblock equals possibility. What I mean by that is you get real clear on what direction or what possibility that you want to create. For me, it was walking across Canada and raising the volume of a conversation on what we can do to prevent, reduce, and end youth homelessness, or at least the current response to it. And so then working backwards, we say, what actions do I need to manage today? What inspiration am I going to connect to? My purpose, my passion. Simon Sinek calls it our why. And what are the predictable situational roadblocks and psychological roadblocks that are going to get me stuck in my tracks? And when I hit those, is my inspiration big enough or my purpose big enough to keep me in action? And so as I actively work through this very simple model, a step at a time, an action at a time, a connection to purpose at a time, I managed to traverse the second widest country in the world. I'll leave you with one last story about what the push for change meant to me. Next slide. When I was in Newfoundland, in the middle of the cold, wet, and rain, you know, it's a good thing that people in Newfoundland are warm because their climate ain't. It was May when we started, and I thought, May is a nice month. It's warm, it's sunny. Not so much in Newfoundland. Anyways, I was walking along this cold, rainy day in Newfoundland, and you know, surrounded by rocks, trees, lakes, and moose, and not much anything else. Big swaths of land in between communities. And I looked down in one moment. Why I looked down, I don't know, but in that moment, something caught my eye. Next slide. It was a penny. And it was a beat up, ugly, old, dirty penny. A penny that was encrusted in mud, and I knocked it on the side of my cart. Penny that looks a lot like this one right here. And I knew it meant something, but I wasn't quite sure. As I continued walking that day, the metaphor became richer and richer. You see, I found that penny in the street. That penny had spent a couple of nights out in the weather. Penny didn't look like the other pennies. Wasn't all shiny, pretty. Certainly didn't look like it did the day it was minted. What occurred to me as I held that penny in my hand is that by the very nature of what it is, that penny can never, ever, ever lose its value. And neither can any human being. I was determined to give that penny and that story to someone. And when we had our closing event at the Vancouver Public Library, I gave one of these pennies that I had found along the way to Mr. Morrison, who's the president of the United Association of Canada, and he traded me with a check for $1 million. Next slide. I believe in change. I believe that sometimes it's hard to see change because it's hard to see through a probability mindset. When we have been assaulted as we have these last 15 months, it's easy to see the world colored in pessimism. As we see continued strife and volleying back and forth across the aisles, where we're not looking at the solutions, we're simply looking for political footballs, where we each stand our ground. I need to believe that we can collapse that and we can work together. I do believe that we are at a watershed moment in human history. And I do believe that we can change. I believe that as each one of us connects to our purpose and our passion and picks up those projects and walks forward with courageous action, carrying the torch of our opus, our push for change, we can and we will change the world. But not a second before we change ourselves. And the reason I believe that is the first time I had that thought, I was sitting on a piece of cardboard in Vancouver, asking the community for a little change. I'll leave you with a poem that was inspired by my friend Gus. Next slide. He picked up a can and continued his walk, this man I saw today. With dirty hair and layered old clothes, he reeked of dreams decayed. With broken tooth and crackled smile, he mumbled for some change. I passed him by, this man I saw, picking through garbage today. You know, a wrong turn here and a bad choice there can lead the best to pain. Such is the fate of some, I guess, to live that life insane. The junkie bum, the wino scum, I have no time today. I'm off to live my life divine. I passed this man today. So off I walked beyond the block and waited for the light. Beside me was a hair salon with mirrors shining bright. I looked at the man in the three-piece suit staring back at me that night, for it was me looking nothing like that man I used to fight. For back those blocks left years behind before I found the key, I realized that man I saw was nothing more than me. Behind me is a broken man, a man you see now free. Life is grand when we understand. There's more to you. There's more to you. There's more to you than what you see. On July 26, 1991, I began walking and taking steps forward to put that life behind me. And I was searching desperately for the better part of me. And I found it. Next slide. I found it thanks to the better part of you. I am a community investment gone well. So often when we deal with the tragic numbers of the opioid crisis and the onslaught of negative news, we forget the positive stories. We forget about the impact that our work does have. I go to recovery meetings, I listen, and many of those people have been touched by the resources and the work that you do every single day. And so I want to encourage you in a time of discouragement, and I want to cheer you on and let you know I'm your champion. Because everything that I have that's good in my life, I have today because I had access to resources, because somewhere, someone in a local government cared enough to push those agendas forward. So that's my time. In closing, I just want to say that I'm here and I'm available if you've got any questions or you want to bounce ideas off me. Next slide. Simple ways that you can connect with me. I can be found at skidrowceo.com, but the easiest way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. So if you've got a LinkedIn profile, please reach out. I've got a great network and I'm constantly putting out really good positive content on, on possibility mindset and also on energy health management. One of the big things I learned in my walk across Canada is how to properly manage energy health, which is really, really big today on stress and burnout. So please connect with me there. It's an honor to have been asked to speak at AVICC today, and I just want to continue to encourage the great work that you do. Cheers.
Wow. On behalf of the AVICC delegates, I want to thank you, Joe, for a fantastic and moving